Welcome to another exciting episode of Point of View. I'm Josh Barnes, and this is my co-host, Justin Barnes. Justin will be joining us again in just a moment. But we're going to be talking about Bart Ehrman today and his last two arguments. We'll have the link in the video description down below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're watching on FISM, I'm sorry, there's probably nothing down below for you to click. That's just how it works on streaming TV channel. But if you want to click on the bottom of your TV screen and see if it takes you somewhere, go for it. Anyway, the link if you're watching on YouTube, there's a link in the description that gives you the original video. So you can actually go watch the entire thing. This one's admittedly edited, first for copyright reasons, and second, because we just don't have time to play his entire video. But we've actually talked about all the things that he's gone through in the Gospels and said are contradictions within the Gospels. Now, this was given at the Defenders Conference in 2019. And he's actually talking to Christian people, trying to convince them that the Gospels should not be considered historically reliable because there's contradictions. Now, that means that Bart Ehrman, who's a scholar, New Testament scholar, who's spent tons of time in textual criticism studying the texts of the Gospels, thinks that these are the most convincing arguments for Christians. Like, these are his best arguments to convince Christians, apparently, right? Because he's presenting them to Christians here. So apparently he thinks these are his best arguments to present to convince you that the Gospels have errors. So we've already walked through all of them. And so check out the other two videos where we responded. This is part 3. And he has 2 more examples in this video that we want to talk about. And then we're going to respond to some of your comments that you've commented on our other videos so far. We've been releasing one a week, so you've had time now, 2 weeks, to make comments and that sort of thing. Let's go to his argument here that the Gospels are in error because of the census in Luke chapter 2 in the Christmas story. By the way, in case I forgot to mention, real quick, before we jump into this, Point of View is the show where we assume that the Bible is true and that to be right about issues, we have to be biblical about them. We do that because Jesus rose from the dead, as is evidenced by the eyewitness testimony we find in the Bible and among other things. So it says Jesus rose from the dead, and he said the Bible is true. The Bible must be true, and therefore we should take it as true and act like it's true. And that's sort of the premise for the show. So this is actually really foundational to the entire point that we're trying to deal with on the show, which is how to look at issues from a biblical worldview. You shouldn't look at issues from a biblical worldview if the Bible isn't accurate. So that is important that we do know that it's accurate. And so I think so far we've shown very handily that these arguments, at least, are not good arguments to prove that the Bible is not trustworthy. But here is Bart Ehrman's next argument, and it's an argument about the historical accuracy of Luke.
There are other kinds of contradictions besides contradictions between Gospels. For example, there are contradictions with known facts of history. Take, for example, this census. So according to Luke chapter 2, I mentioned it earlier, Caesar Augustus is the Roman emperor, and we're told that under Caesar Augustus, there was a census, and the entire world had to register for the census. There was no worldwide census under Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus's reign is really well documented. There was never a census throughout the Roman Empire that everybody had to follow, let alone a census where everybody registered for the census by going to their ancestral home. There was no census of any kind throughout the Roman Empire under Caesar Augustus, period. All right, so there are contradictions in known facts of history.
There was no census of any kind throughout the Roman Empire under Caesar Augustus. It is true that we do not have any records of the specific censuses that took place under Caesar Augustus. But we do know that there were censuses that took place under Caesar Augustus. Okay, let me read to you from a really good source here, Ellicott, who writes on this subject. He said, "It may be admitted that no Roman or Jewish historian speaks distinctly of a general census made at this time." So it just so happens that no Roman or Jewish historian that we have found spoke directly about a general census made at this time. On the other hand, the collection of statistical returns of this nature was an ever reoccurring feature of the policy of Augustus, that's Caesar. We read of such returns at intervals of about 10 years during the whole period of his government. In BC 27, when he offered to resign, he laid before the Senate a rationarium, or survey of the whole empire. After his death, a like document, more epitomized, was produced. It's called the Breviarium. Was produced as having been compiled by him. So Caesar Augustus, though we don't have any historians of Jewish or Roman historians who wrote about a worldwide census, Caesar Augustus, when he died and throughout his reign, produced statistics of his empire that showed that he must have done censuses to find these statistics. And you can find one in the Breviarium. I'm giving you actual source material here. We do know that censuses must have taken place. They have to have occurred, though we don't have the specifics. There are traces of one about the time of the writing that Luke is talking about when Jesus was born. There are traces of one census made about this time, made by the emperor, not as his character as censor, but as an imperial edict, such as St. Luke here describes. So there are traces of the possibility that a censor took place, and we know that censors had to have taken place in order to produce documents like the Breviarium, and the Rationarium. So we know that these things took place. But yet, here is Bart Ehrman claiming there was no censuses of any kind. No, we don't have documentation of any specific census. But we do know that there were censuses that took place across the Roman Empire. We know this as a fact. Also, just before the death of Herod, Josephus wrote that in Wars, wrote that there was an agitation among the Jews, which led them to require them to take an oath of fidelity, not to himself only, but also to the emperor, and that 6,000 Pharisees refused to take it. He doesn't say what caused it, but the census which Luke records, holding out as it did the prospect of future taxation in the modern sense, sufficiently explains it. So we do know that right after this taxation that Luke talks about, there was this sort of rebellion. Herod had to force people to take an oath of solidarity and fidelity to the emperor. And 6,000 Pharisees refused to. And the reason probably could feasibly have been that there was a census that they were taking that they were upset about. And we do have a historian who writes about a census. Luke does. Luke has been called a historian of the finest order. His statements of fact were very trustworthy by many, many historians who have looked into the Gospel of Luke. Luke has been very accurate in everything they've checked on. And so here we do have a historian, Luke, who writes it. It also may be noted that the early opponents of Christianity, such as Celsus, who wrote in the 2nd century, in the 100, I think he lived from 135 until or 175, something like that. Yeah, it was 175 to 200 and something AD. And Porphyry, who lived from 235 to, I think, 280 or 305 BC, AD. These are early Christian skeptics. They were anti-Christian arguers. They argued against Christianity in the early first 100 years after Christ, or first 100 years after Christ or so. 175 would have been, 130 years or so. And they never used the fact that there wasn't a census under Caesar Augustus as an argument against Christianity, which they would have known, right? If they were like 100 years or so after the Caesar Augustus, they would have had more records available to them that would have been able to argue this with actual certainty, but they didn't, which is another evidence that there were censuses during this time, and this is a plausible reality. And given the fact that Luke is accurate on all other historical matters, we have to assume that he was accurate here. Why would we not? So what we don't have here is the Gospel of Luke contradicting known facts of history. What we do have is the fact that there hasn't been produced other historians that have recorded the same thing as Luke in this instance. But that doesn't mean that it's contradicting known facts of history. And we do know for a fact that Caesar Augustus had detailed records of his empire. So therefore, he must have done censuses. This is actually a really bad argument, Ehrman. And honestly, as much as I respect his scholarship and his intelligence, I think that this argument expresses something where he is biased toward any argument that seems to prove that the Gospels are in contradiction. He hears these arguments and he just accepts them. It seems that he simply accepts them without really doing any research on the opposing side of these arguments, because it seems very simple and very easy to find. Here's his last argument in the video, and I think you'll see very quickly that this is a nonsense argument as well.
And there are issues of just kind of general historical plausibility in the Gospels. A famous example is Matthew 27, when Jesus is crucified, and the graves are opened up, and these people rise from the dead, and they start walking around in Jerusalem, which is often seen as one of the weirder passages in the New Testament, and kind of hard to figure out. And really, I mean, these are like zombie figures or something. Presumably they die again, and it's like, what? I mean, so much. Of course. I mean, there are a lot of even evangelicals who will say that, okay, that's like, it's not really literal.
Not me.
Okay, I am so pleased with that. I'm happy with that. It's fine. It's not literal. If you don't think that's literal, why do you think other passages are literal? Well, that one defies probability. Okay, how about walking on the water? Does that defy probability? No, you can do that. You can do that? Let me see you do that. Well, Jesus could do that. Yeah, of course, because God empowered him. But God could empower these people to rise from the dead and walk around Jerusalem. Okay? So if you're going to say this one didn't happen, why do you say that one did happen? On what grounds do you say that?
I don't say that. Okay, so his argument here is that it's just not historically plausible that people could resurrect, that people resurrected. It's just not plausible, historically speaking, that people resurrected as zombies and then presumably died again. Well, okay. All right. I know it's not historically plausible that miraculous things happened. I suppose you could say that miraculous things, we shouldn't just assume that they happened. But since we have defended the accuracy of the Gospels and all of the other areas, and since we know that the Gospels are well attested documents, eyewitness testimony that have been confirmed over and over and over again, and since Jesus rose from the dead, it's actually a consensus among scholars that Jesus was a real person. He really died by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans. His followers really had a real experience where they really thought that they really saw Jesus, and that his followers really died professing that was the truth. And the majority of scholars also agree that the tomb was really found empty after Jesus was buried. There's only one good conclusion from these, and that is that Jesus rose from the dead. Since Jesus rose from the dead, it's not hard to believe that other people could rise from the dead too if Jesus did it, right? So this is not historically implausible. And I do think he's right about one thing, though. He says that those evangelicals who say that well, this is figurative. It's not true. They are being inconsistent, because why isn't it true? Is it not true just because you feel like it couldn't be true? Because everything else in the Bible couldn't be true either, unless God did it. And if God created the world, that pretty much guarantees that he could have done this, right? He could have done this, and he said he did it. So we believe he did it, right? So it's not historically implausible. And the fact that they were only probably around for a very short time, and they either ascended into heaven or died again. They were probably, at the time, it says many of the saints arose. They were probably people who had died recently, who were followers of Jesus, like people who had just recently died, who were following him. So it was proof when they rose that Jesus, because they were direct followers of Jesus. If Abraham had risen from the dead at this time, people wouldn't recognize him. They wouldn't know what he looks like. They didn't have a picture of Abraham. They didn't know what he looked like. But if it was recent people who had recently died, who had been following Jesus, and now they rose from the dead, this would just confirm the power of Christ and the resurrection to those who they appeared to. So, and it would also mean that the people who are believers in Christ would write about it, and people who are not believers in Christ would not write about it, because they would not want to advance the cause of Christ. So therefore, it would make sense then that you wouldn't have a bunch of different people writing about these people rising from the dead, because they probably only really appeared to specific people, and those who were antagonists to the Christian cause wouldn't want it written about anyway. So that seems to be pretty simple, pretty obvious. It's definitely not a contradiction, right? There's no contradiction here between historically plausible and whether or not it happened. Things that are historically plausible do happen. And with that, I bring on Justin Barnes, because Justin, most of the comments that we're going to read are about you. But before we get to those, what do you think about these last two arguments by Ehrman?
Well, they're not good. I think maybe he saved the worst for last. But on the first one, the claim he makes is just on its face not true. We have no record of this census. Yes, you do. It's called the Book of Luke.
Right.
If you want to be a textual critic, you deal with historical documents. The Book of Luke is a historical document that documents the census. You may not accept it, but you can't claim you don't have a reference to it in history, because the Book of Luke is a historical document. It's not just a religious text. So you have it right there by a guy who, like you said, is a historian, and along with a lot of other backing information. So on its face, just simply not true. This is what people want to make you forget a lot, is that the Bible is a collection of historical documents. So it's just on its face bad. But the second one, I want you to understand what Ehrman wants you to accept about this thing with the people getting up, because Matthew talks about the dead rising, going into the city and appearing to a bunch of people. What it appears that Matthew is doing is he's doing a little bit of apologetics, saying, hey, I'm not only in fulfilled prophecy, but also, hey, just like Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus appeared to 500 brethren, most of whom are still alive. What's he doing? He's making a falsifiable claim. Matthew here saying, hey, a bunch of people in the city at that time had these dead people go and talk to them, these now not dead people. And you can tell that that Matthew is doing some apologetics, because in the very next chapter, a couple paragraphs later, Matthew gives an apologetic against an argument that was very popular in the day. He talks about the guards. It says in Matthew 28:11, now when they were going, behold, some of the watch came into the city and showed up to the chief priests all the things that were done. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave large money unto the soldiers, saying, say ye, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept. And if this come to the governor's ear, we will persuade him and secure you. So they took the money and did as they were taught. What Matthew is saying is the guards that were at Jesus' tomb, they went to the religious leaders and they said, just say the disciples came and stole the body while you were asleep, and we'll make sure you don't get killed for it, even though you probably should, because that was your job. That's what they say. But then look at what Matthew says. And this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. Matthew is addressing an apologetic specifically in his time. Matthew is worried about the arguments going around. If there was a big pushback against this idea of people having risen and come out, he's saying this is a falsifiable thing. You can go talk to people who talked to those who rose from the dead. Go prove me wrong. And he's also saying, hey guys, here's the common arguments we're hearing these days. Here's where that comes from. So Matthew is very much so not trying to make a claim that's just out of the blue and yeah, people came out of the grave. Yeah, that too. Let's just throw that into it. No. He's very specifically trying to be apologetic about this. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't ever want to hear a Bart Ehrman use an argument about the God of the gaps anymore. Because what he just gave you is the argument from the gap. Yeah, the contradictions from the gaps. We don't have any evidence of this, that, or the other, therefore it never happened. Well, good luck proving evolution. I mean, good luck proving the Big Bang. You can't go back and find a historical record of these things. So please stop saying, because we don't have record, even though the Bible is a record, that means it is a contradiction and a error in the Bible. That's just not how logic works. You need to do better.
I made a quote earlier, and I wanted to give you the source for that. It was archaeologist Sir William Ramsay, who was a skeptic at first, and he wrote that Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, he should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. And then also, I think it was Blakelock, who wrote, for accuracy and detail and for evocation of atmosphere, Luke stands in fact with Thucydides. The Acts of the Apostles is not shoddy product of pious imagining, but a trustworthy record. It was a spade work of archaeology, which first revealed the truth. And that was professor of classics at Auckland University, E.M. Blakelock, and many other quotes from scholars who have looked at Luke and said, no, this is a historically trustworthy, reliable document that we should hold as helpful for us to understand other history things of the time.
Yeah, and by the way, I got to ask Bart Ehrman how many times they want to keep playing this game where they say, well, we have no record of this, therefore the Bible's wrong. And then eventually we find record of that, like Pontius Pilate, or a lot of other stuff throughout archaeological evidence. For a long time, people thought that John was like a really late book because the going theory was that it was written 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. Like I think it was the German school of textual critics were just that was the going theory, and then we find P52, which is late. 1st century, early 2nd century document, which just shatters that whole thing. This is what happens every single time. It's, we have no evidence, therefore Bible bad. And then, oh, look, we found evidence. Guess we won't print a retraction.
Exactly right. And just in case our detractors are watching, I'm gonna guess that this is okay since he put the comment on YouTube publicly. I'm gonna use his name. I hope that's okay, Nick. If you want to be anonymous, just please in your comments put anonymous or something like that. So that way, if I read your comments, I will read them anonymously. But Nick put this, and he said, "Oh my gosh, you literally said that the fact that Ehrman is one of the top New Testament textual critics doesn't mean that he's good with the content of them," which I think is a statement you made, Justin, on our first video. Referring to the New Testament and the Gospels, he says, for Pete's sake, his PhD is from Princeton Theological Seminary, and he spent 3 years at Moody Bible Institute, but he doesn't understand the theology of the New Testament. I mean, come on. He was a pastor of a church in New Jersey. To say he isn't good with the content of the New Testament is just ridiculous, says Nick Bracing. Look, I am not some sort of Ehrman disciple or anything. I listen to everything, but you are so blatantly and dishonestly talking about who he is and what he says that I just wonder what in the world is going on here. Justin, what is your response to Nick on that?
Well, Nick, the fact that I understand what a textual critic is actually not dishonest. And the fact that you misunderstand that is not my fault. When I say that Bart Ehrman is one of the leading textual critics, I'm not feigning, I'm not making fun of him or something like. He is a leading textual critic. A textual critic is not a theologian. It's somebody who can handle ancient manuscripts, analyze them, and yes, work with some of the content of them in the sense of finding the original readings. Sometimes things with datings, though, sometimes that's like papyrologists, things like that. But when I say he's a leading textual critic, I'm talking about someone who can analyze textual variants, someone who can look at the readings and find, this one is probably original, that one probably isn't, that sort of thing. We're not talking about someone who has mastered the theology of the New Testament. Just because someone graduates from a theological seminary does not mean they're instantly good at theology. Bart Ehrman has a book, forget exactly what it's called, but it's something like When Jesus Became God, or something like that. And his whole argument is Jesus, over time, becomes God. He wasn't originally accepted as God. When that is on its face not true, because I could point you to Ignatius of Antioch, who writes at the latest in 108 AD when he dies, and he calls Jesus God over and over and over and over again. My point is, Ehrman is good as a textual critic in his field of variant readings and manuscripts, but he's not good at coming up with good conclusions of what the theology was in the early church, because he is demonstrably wrong over and over again. And again, all I have to do is point you to Titus, where Paul calls Jesus our God and Savior. First Peter, I think it's First Peter, where Peter calls Jesus our God and Savior. Ignatius, who calls Jesus our great God, and over and over throughout the New Testament and early church history, and show you, Ehrman got this very, very wrong. So when he steps outside of his field of textual criticism, he is not to be trusted like he is a master of the field, because he is not.
Real quick, Nick replied here's just a pull quote from one of his replies, because I asked him to actually deal with the content, for instance, on Jairus' daughter, and Nick said, so here's on Jairus' daughter. One version said she was dying when her father came to Jesus. The other said she was already dead when her father came to Jesus. Not a great example, but certainly contradictory, Nick says. And that's what Bart is saying. They both can't be true as written. Is there a plausible explanation? Sure, I think you gave one. Does it make it not a contradiction? No. We didn't give a plausible explanation. We pointed out that it isn't a contradiction, because one is summarizing and everything that's going to take place in the story before it tells a few of the details of the story, and one is giving actual chronological details. That doesn't mean that, oh, well, this is a contradiction, that's just a plausible explanation for the contradiction. No. That is showing that this isn't a contradiction. To be contradictory, they would have to be mutually exclusive. One actually denies the other one from being possible. And that's certainly not the case. But unfortunately, Justin, I can't give you the last word because that's all of our time. And thanks for joining us today on Point of View. We'll see you next time. Don't forget to go check out White Mountain Munchies and use the promo code RAM on whitemountainmunchies.com. We'll see you next time.